Welcome to the Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're listening or watching from. We'd love to hear from our fellow mystery lovers around the world. Miss Marple and the Rosewood Confession, Chapter 1. A Whisper in the Willows. It was a bright but deceptive morning in late spring when Miss Marple arrived at Rosewood on the Wold, a sleepy little village nestled at the edge of a wooded valley. The train had chugged in with a courteous whistle, the sort that belonged more to another age than the present one, and Jane Marple, neatly gloved and holding a modest carpet bag, stepped down with the air of someone who knew both her destination and her role in the day's quiet theatre. She had been invited somewhat unexpectedly by her old school friend, Beatrice Lytton. "Do come, Jane," the letter had said in her precise but slightly agitated hand. "Horace is dead, and while they say it was an accident, I know something isn't right. I can't prove it, but I feel it deep in my bones. You always did notice what others missed. Perhaps you'll notice something here too." Miss Marple, never one to ignore a friend's distress, nor an unsolved puzzle, had accepted at once. And now, as she sat beside Beatrice in the drawing room of Rosewood Manor, sipping tea from a thin porcelain cup, her eyes wandered with quiet intent across the room. The manor was as one would expect of an old English house, comfortable but not ostentatious, filled with heirlooms and the faint scent of lavender polish. A marble clock on the mantelpiece ticked with subdued dignity. Outside the French windows, the garden gleamed with dew, its paths winding between rose beds and clusters of willow trees that whispered in the breeze. Beatrice, a handsome woman with greying curls pinned neatly under a netted hat, was clearly unsettled. She poured the tea with a trembling hand. "They said he fell," she said abruptly, as if continuing a conversation already begun in her head. "From the garden terrace. It was raining, and they said the stone was slippery. But Horace never walked out there in bad weather. He had arthritis, Jane. He hated the damp." Miss Marple nodded gently. "People often do things they wouldn't normally when agitated or frightened." Beatrice glanced sharply at her. "You think he was frightened?" "I don't know," Miss Marple said mildly. "But you do? Otherwise you wouldn't have asked me here." There was a pause. The clock ticked. A bird chirped somewhere in the garden, then stopped abruptly. Beatrice set her cup down. "There have been odd things since he died." Miss Marple waited. "I found the back door open one morning, though I know I locked it. Elsie, my maid, says she's heard whispering in the halls, and 2 days ago the key to Horace's study vanished, only to turn up in the laundry basket." "Really?" said Miss Marple in a tone that conveyed far more interest than surprise. "And who lives here now?" "Just me and Elsie. The gardener, Miles, comes in from the village daily. Horace's niece, Cora, arrived last week, said she was too upset to stay away, and then there's Lionel March, an antique dealer. Horace consulted him about selling some of the family pieces. He's still here, claims he's appraising the collection." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very thorough of him." Beatrice sighed. "I don't trust any of them, Jane. And that's a horrible thing to say, isn't it? But I don't." "There's nothing horrible about sensing unease," Miss Marple replied. "People often feel such things long before they know why. Tell me, did Horace have any disagreements, quarrels, threats?" Beatrice looked out towards the garden. "He was a difficult man, proud, private. He and Cora hadn't spoken in 5 years, and she only returned when she realized the will might affect her. Lionel was always too smooth, and Miles, well, he keeps to himself. But I think Horace had secrets, Jane. I truly do. At that moment, Elsie entered, a slight, anxious-looking girl with pale skin and nervous hands. She carried a tray of scones and set it down too quickly, causing a teaspoon to clatter. "Sorry, miss," she mumbled. "Didn't mean to startle." "No harm done," Beatrice said wearily. Miss Marple gave Elsie a kind smile. "Have you worked here long?" "2 years, ma'am." "And did you like Mr. Lytton?" Elsie hesitated. "He was, particular? Like things just so? Didn't like doors left open or whistling?" "Quite right, too," Miss Marple said with a twinkle. "Whistling indoors always leads to unpleasantness. My cousin Mildred swore her vase collection was doomed by it." Elsie gave a ghost of a smile and left. Miss Marple rose and walked to the window. She observed the garden, its gravel paths, and the raised stone terrace from which Horace had fallen. It seemed innocent enough in the morning light, but her eyes narrowed. She noted a small dark stain on one of the stones. Faint, old, but not rainwater. "I'd like to see the terrace," she said. Beatrice nodded. "Of course, but be careful. It's still damp." They stepped into the garden, and Miss Marple moved slowly, taking in every detail. The footprints half lost in the gravel, the slight groove where a cane might have slid, and something else. A crushed sprig of elderflower, too fresh to be from last week. As they approached the balustrade, she paused. The drop below was steeper than expected. A fall from here would do more than bruise. "Was Horace wearing gloves?" she asked suddenly. He hated gloves," Beatrice replied. "Always said they made him feel like a pallbearer." Miss Marple's lips pursed. She bent slightly, running her hand along the stone rail. Her fingers touched something sticky, sap perhaps, or blood. She didn't speak, not yet, but her eyes grew thoughtful. The willows stirred behind them, and the wind whispered something no one else could hear. Chapter 2. The Broken Figurine. Later that same afternoon, the manor settled into its customary hush, the kind of hush that doesn't belong to peace, but rather to waiting. Miss Marple sat near the parlour window, her knitting needles clicking softly. Outside, the light was beginning to shift, golden and slanted, casting long shadows from the willow trees across the lawn. Inside, the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 4. "Mrs. Lytton," called a voice from the hallway. "Telephone for you." "It's the solicitor's office." Beatrice excused herself, and Miss Marple was left alone. Or so it seemed. In truth, she never considered herself alone in such houses. The very walls seemed to whisper if one listened carefully. She stood, walking gently around the room. Her eyes paused on the shelf to the right of the fireplace. A row of delicate porcelain figurines, each of them glazed in soft pastels, and all seemingly engaged in courtly dances or romantic serenades. There were 8 in total, or rather, there had been 8. She noticed the dust pattern, a faint square where another figurine had once stood, now conspicuously absent. A short trail of scattered white flakes dusted the carpet below. Miss Marple bent and picked up a small shard. It was part of a tiny hand, fingers outstretched, with a fleck of green paint still visible on the cuff. She murmured to herself. Such little hands. One wonders whose were larger. Moments later, a sharp cry rang from the drawing room. "Mrs. Lytton, look what's happened!" Miss Marple followed the sound to find Elsie in tears, pointing to the hearthrug. There, lying in several pieces, was the missing figurine. Its torso was intact, but the head had been cleanly separated, and now lay several inches away, face down, as if in shame. "I dusted in here not an hour ago," Elsie said, panicked. "It was all right then, I swear it." Beatrice, returning with a furrowed brow, looked startled. Good heavens, that one was Horace's favourite. Miss Marple gently picked up the head, turning it in her gloved fingers. No chips along the neck. It broke too smoothly. "Are you suggesting someone did this deliberately?" Beatrice asked. Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She was examining the mantel shelf again. One of the other figurines, a lady with a fan, had been moved slightly out of line. "Elsie," she said gently, "was anyone else in the parlour today?" The girl hesitated. "Well, Miss Cora came in to read, and Mr. March looked in earlier. Said he was checking the provenance of the antique mirror. And did you notice anything missing apart from the figurine?" "No, ma'am, except, well, someone left the sideboard drawer open. I shut it when I saw. It's not my place to tidy that, usually." Miss Marple glanced at the drawer. She opened it slowly. Inside, a neat collection of silverware lay wrapped in soft cloth, but one of the cloths had muddy smudges on its corner. "Interesting," said Miss Marple quietly. They were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. "Ah, there you all are," said Lionel March, entering with casual ease and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Beatrice replied stiffly. Lionel moved to the fireplace, noticing the broken figurine. "Oh dear," he said with a mock gasp. "Another casualty of this drafty old house, I suppose." Miss Marple said nothing. She simply turned the porcelain head in her hand once more and placed it gently on the table. Then she resumed her knitting with quiet focus. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. The table had been laid with fine bone china, and a roast had been served, but the food seemed merely ornamental. No one ate with appetite. Cora Lytton, a woman of perhaps 35, with a feline grace and watchful eyes, picked at her potatoes. "You know," she said suddenly, "I remember Horace once said that those figurines would be worth a fortune one day. And now look, smashed." Beatrice gave her a cool glance. "They were more sentimental than valuable." Lionel, carving a slice of beef for himself, chuckled. "You'd be surprised what collectors will pay for sentiment. Even a broken piece has a story, if marketed correctly." Elsie brought in the dessert, steamed pudding and custard, and promptly tripped, nearly dropping the tray. "Steady, girl," Lionel snapped. Elsie flushed and mumbled an apology. Her hands trembled as she served Miss Marple, who smiled at her gently. "It's quite all right. We all have our off days." "Especially when ghosts walk the halls," muttered Cora under her breath. "What was that?" asked Beatrice sharply. "Nothing," Cora replied, stirring her custard lazily. "Just, sometimes I feel like someone's watching." There was a moment's silence, broken only by the steady ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple dabbed at the corner of her mouth with her napkin. "I rather think, Miss Lytton, that houses remember, especially old ones. They remember quarrels, regrets, secrets, and sometimes, if one listens very carefully, they whisper." Lionel snorted. "You sound like a novelist, Miss Marple." "Oh no," she said pleasantly, "just a spinster from St. Mary Mead, who finds people fascinating." Later that evening, as the others retired, Miss Marple remained in the drawing room. She returned to the figurine. Gently, she arranged the pieces in their former shape on a handkerchief, like a child's puzzle. Something about the head's clean separation still bothered her. Not accidental, intentional. But not out of rage, no. This was symbolic, almost theatrical. She picked up the piece with the delicate green cuff again. It was the same shade as the elderflower near the terrace. A coincidence? Perhaps. But Miss Marple did not believe in coincidence. She rose and opened the sideboard drawer again. This time, she noticed something wedged at the back. A half-folded handkerchief. Monogrammed. Not Beatrice's. Not Horace's either. She tucked it into her sleeve, extinguished the lamps, and went quietly upstairs. Chapter 3. Letters in the Hearth. The following morning brought a brisk wind through the valley and a scattering of blossoms across the gravel paths outside Rosewood Manor. Inside, the house retained its hush, disturbed only by the occasional clatter of teacups or the soft echo of distant footsteps along the upstairs corridor. Miss Marple descended the stairs just after 7, earlier than anyone else, her knitting tucked under one arm and a purposeful air about her. She had made it a habit over the years to rise early. Trouble, she often said, preferred the quiet hours before breakfast. In the drawing room, she found the fire had not been laid. The hearth, however, was flecked with grey ash, and the faint smell of burnt paper still lingered. Curious. She fetched the poker, knelt before the grate, and gently stirred the remains of the last fire. A few blackened cinders flaked apart, and from beneath them something white emerged, half-curled and scorched around the edges. With delicate fingers, she extracted the pieces and laid them out upon a nearby sheet of newspaper. There were 3 separate fragments of correspondence. The first bore no heading, only a signature in looping feminine script. Yours, always, E.L. The second appeared to be a reply, tersely worded and signed H. Lytton. The third, partially destroyed, mentioned the phrase, "What's owed must be settled," and curiously, the word inheritance. Miss Marple sat back in her chair and read what she could. The ink was faded, and the flames had done their mischief, but the tone, yes, the tone was unmistakably bitter, and behind bitterness always was pain. She tucked the fragments inside a brown envelope and returned to her seat by the window, just as the door creaked open and Elsie entered with the breakfast tray. "Oh, I didn't know you'd already come down, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Just making use of the quiet. The morning light is rather better for spotting things, don't you think?" Elsie hesitated. "Yes, miss, though I prefer not to look too closely at anything these days." "Because of the whispers?" Miss Marple asked gently. Elsie froze for a moment, her hands tightening on the tray. Then she looked down. "It's an old house, that's all. And sometimes when the wind comes down through the chimney, it plays tricks on your ears." "Quite." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Did Mr. Lytton ever receive letters from someone called E.L.?" Elsie looked surprised. "Yes, I think so. Now and again a letter would come with just initials. He always read them in the garden, and never let anyone else touch them." "And after he'd read them?" "I think he burned them," she said, then added uncertainly, "most of them." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Very wise of him, though some ashes are reluctant to stay buried." Elsie looked as though she might say more, but stopped herself, bit her lip, and excused herself to fetch fresh scones. Later that day, while the others were occupied, Cora had taken to rearranging her uncle's old books. Lionel was in the cellar under the pretext of inventory. Miss Marple made her way to the study. The door creaked slightly as she opened it, and a musty scent greeted her. Leather-bound ledgers, dried ink, and the faint trace of pipe smoke. She moved slowly, her eyes alert to detail. On the writing desk sat a blotter, a fountain pen, and a pair of cracked spectacles. Horace's, no doubt. There were no new letters, but inside the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a sheaf of blank paper, she found a small photograph. Faded. A young girl in a summer dress holding a daisy chain and smiling up at the camera with unmistakable adoration. On the back, written faintly in the same looping script, "To Horace, from E." There was no surname, but Miss Marple was already beginning to form a picture. She stepped into the hallway only to find herself face to face with Miles, the gardener. He gave her a stiff nod, tugging at his cap. "Morning, madam." "Good morning, Mr. Miles. A fine day for roses." He gave a grunt. "Too windy. blows the bud straight off the stem. She tilted her head. You've worked here long? Nigh on 10 years. And you were here the evening Mr. Lytton passed away? His brow furrowed. Aye, tending the greenhouse. Rain was coming in, had to move the bulbs in. Did you see anyone in the garden? He hesitated. Just shadows, can't be sure. But something caught your attention. Miles scratched at his neck. There was someone down by the terrace, looked like a woman, but I didn't see her face. Could have been Miss Cora or that housemaid. The gardener stiffened, eyes narrowing. Where'd you hear that name? I saw it in the churchyard. Her headstone was recently cleaned. Miles looked away. Best to let old stones lie, miss. But old stones can be quite talkative, I've found. He mumbled something inaudible and left before she could press further. That afternoon, as the wind grew stronger and the house settled once more into silence, Miss Marple joined Beatrice in the parlour. There's something quite tragic here, she said softly, and not only because Horace is dead. Beatrice looked up. You found something? I found fragments, a photograph, letters, and a great deal of tension. Beatrice sighed. This house has always had secrets. Horace was, private. But I believe he regretted something. In his final months, he became more withdrawn. He even asked me, out of the blue, whether I believed in ghosts. And do you? Beatrice gave a small, mirthless laugh. Not the floating kind, but I believe in memory and guilt. Miss Marple said nothing. Instead, she looked once more at the fire grate, where ashes still lingered. Not all of them from coal. And above them, on the mantel, the remaining porcelain figurines stood watching, still, silent, waiting. Chapter 4. The Gardener's Tale. It was just past 10 when Miss Marple took her usual place in the garden, wrapped in a shawl and seated on the wrought-iron bench beneath the largest of the willow trees. The breeze was brisk that morning, and birdsong came in short bursts from the hedgerows, as though even the robins were hesitant to break the hush that had fallen over Rosewood Manor. She wasn't knitting for once. Her hands were still, folded neatly in her lap. Ah, she was waiting. Presently, the sound of shears clipping at a hedge reached her ears. A pair of muddy boots came into view, followed by the angular frame of Miles the gardener. He was carrying a coil of wire and muttering something about rabbits. "Good morning, Mr. Miles," she called out softly as though addressing a squirrel. He stopped, gave her a wary glance and nodded. "Morning, miss. Would you mind terribly if I borrowed a moment of your time?" He hesitated. "Got to tend the east beds before lunch." "It won't take more than 5 minutes. I was hoping for a little perspective. You see, I'm not quite as sprightly as I once was, and I'm always curious to learn how things really work, especially gardens. They're such repositories of secrets, don't you think?" He raised an eyebrow. "You mean gossip?" Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh no, I mean roots. Some go very deep, some strangle what grows beside them." Miles grunted, then slowly set down the coil of wire and perched awkwardly on the opposite end of the bench. "You said yesterday that you saw someone near the terrace the night Horace died," she began gently. "I said I might have seen someone. Yes, of course. My mistake." She paused. "But it's odd, isn't it? You didn't mention it to the police at the time." He glanced away. "Didn't want trouble. Don't want it now." "Trouble has a way of finding people, whether they want it or not. But truth has its own rewards." He sighed. "I did see someone, thin, cloaked. Might have been that maid or the niece. I can't say." "Did you hear anything?" A raised voice. "One only, like someone losing patience." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully across the garden. "And the elderflowers? The crushed ones beneath the terrace?" Miles turned sharply. You noticed that? I notice most things, Mr. Miles. He hesitated again, then leaned forward, voice lower. Those flowers aren't from the beds. They were freshly picked. Somebody left them there. A bouquet? A small one, tied with string. Set down, almost, respectfully, like someone paying their dues. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. And where is it now? I took it to the compost, same night. Didn't want the others seeing it. Thought it'd stir things up. It already has. That afternoon, as clouds gathered overhead, Miss Marple took a walk into the village. The church was unlocked, a modest flint building with a weathered bell tower and a tidy graveyard enclosed by yew hedges. The vicar, a mild and scholarly man named Reverend Phipps, greeted her warmly and offered tea, which she declined in favour of walking the headstones. She found it easily. Edith Lanyon, beloved daughter, 1890 to 1917. The stone had indeed been recently cleaned. The moss had been scraped away and the engraving re-inked. Someone had made a quiet effort to preserve it. Reverend Phipps joined her. You're the guest up at Rosewood, are you? I am Jane Marple. Miss Lytton's friend. Yes, of course. Tragic business, that. Yes, she said quietly. Tell me, Edith Lanyon, was she well known in the village? The vicar looked uncomfortable. That name hasn't passed many lips in years. She was Horace's cousin, distant but close in age. They grew up together. Were they close? Very. Too close, according to some. She left suddenly. Whispers, of course, there always are. And she never married? Number died young. Pneumonia, I believe, after circumstances. Miss Marple gave a slight nod. And the grave, was it always kept so well? Number. In fact, it had all but disappeared under the ivy. I was quite surprised when I saw it cleaned. About when was that? Oh, 2 weeks ago, perhaps, just before Mr. Lytton's accident, now that you mention it. She thanked him and left with her mind racing. Upon returning to the manor, she found Cora in the music room, playing something vaguely tragic on the piano. The notes hung in the air like unanswered questions. You've a good touch, Miss Marple offered. Cora looked over her shoulder. Just keeping my fingers busy helps with the waiting. Waiting for what, my dear? For the will to be read, for the house to be mine, for something, anything, to make sense. Miss Marple sat across from her. Did you know Edith Lanyon? Cora's fingers faltered. Heard of her? Mother mentioned her once, said she was the family mistake. And yet someone cleaned her grave. Probably that gardener. He's got a sentimental streak, whether he admits it or not. Miss Marple let the silence settle, watching Cora carefully. Why did you really return to Rosewood? She asked. Cora smiled thinly. Family duty. And the photograph you took from Horace's desk, the one of the little girl? Cora's expression didn't change, but her hands closed over her lap. I didn't take anything. Of course not, dear. That evening, thunder rolled in the distance. The storm hadn't yet arrived, but the wind had a restless edge. Miss Marple, writing in her notebook, paused as a shadow moved past the drawing-room door. She rose, opened it, and stepped into the hall. The light flickered overhead. The house creaked. Then she heard it, a low whispering sound, unmistakable this time, drifting from the linen cupboard on the landing. She climbed the stairs slowly, every step echoing beneath her. The cupboard stood closed. She reached for the handle. The door opened with a sudden jolt, and Elsie stood there, pale as a sheet, clutching something in her hand. A key, she whispered. I found it inside the cupboard, but that's not all. There's a hollow space behind the towels. Miss Marple took the key, turning it in her fingers. It was old, brass, engraved faintly with the number 14. The house held its breath, and Miss Marple smiled. Chapter 5. A Rose with No Thorns. The storm did not come that night after all. It lingered at the horizon, teasing with distant rumblings and brief flashes of light beyond the valley. Rosewood Manor lay beneath a heavy stillness, as if the very walls were listening. Miss Marple sat in her room, the key Elsie had found lying on her lap, like a forgotten relic from a ghost story. The engraving, 14, was faint, the metal worn smooth from years of use. It had not been touched in a very long time, she suspected. But why hide it behind a cupboard, and why now? At breakfast, the household was subdued. Beatrice sipped her tea with barely a word. Cora was in one of her irritable moods, refusing toast and instead flicking through an old gardening almanac as if it might contain the answers to her uncle's death. Lionel arrived late, charming as always, claiming he had overslept due to excessive contemplation of the rain. Miss Marple, meanwhile, turned the conversation quite deliberately toward graves. "Your churchyard is a most peaceful," she said to Beatrice. "So many interesting stories in stone." Beatrice nodded vaguely. "It's been there since the 17th century, I believe. Horace used to visit from time to time, oddly enough. Not the sentimental type, usually. And yet Edith Lanyon's grave has been cleaned recently." Cora looked up sharply. "Who?" "Your uncle's cousin," Miss Marple said. "She died very young. I imagine not many people remember her." "No one in the family ever spoke of her," Beatrice added, "except once. Horace mentioned her in passing, said she was unlucky." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Unlucky. An interesting word, don't you think? So often used when one can't, or won't, say wronged." The room fell silent. Later that day, with the others otherwise occupied, Miss Marple asked Miles to escort her to the old potting shed beside the east garden wall. She claimed she was looking for a particular type of rose. "One without thorns," she said cheerfully. "I doubt you'll find one here," Miles replied. "Even the prettiest rose has defences." "Quite so," said Miss Marple. The potting shed, once used for drying herbs and storing tools, had long been neglected. But Miles, ever dutiful, fetched the key from the kitchen and unlocked the door with a rusty twist. Inside was dust, damp, and the scent of mildew. Shelves lined the walls, and in the centre stood an old wooden table covered in gardening gloves, cracked clay pots, and an empty seed catalogue from 1915. Miss Marple walked slowly around the shed, fingers trailing lightly over surfaces. And then she saw it, a small tin plaque above one of the shelves, almost obscured by cobwebs. "Number 14. Private storage." She turned to Miles. "This wouldn't happen to match this, would it?" she asked, producing the brass key. He frowned. "Well, I'll be, That used to be Horace's locked shelf. No one had the key. He kept it hidden, even from Beatrice." Miss Marple inserted the key, turned it gently, and heard the click. Behind the small door was a dusty black tin box. Inside lay several items, each wrapped in layers of tissue. A child's drawing of a house with smoke curling from the chimney, a faded love letter, a ribbon of blue silk, and a woman's brooch in the shape of a rose, with the thorns filed away. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilskin, a small revolver. By the time Miss Marple returned to the house, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. Beatrice met her in the hallway, looking drawn. "There's something I haven't told you," she said abruptly. Miss Marple followed her into the parlour, where the fire had been lit against the coming storm. "I've been receiving letters," Beatrice confessed. "Anonymous, just single lines. You owe her still. There's blood on the ivy." I thought they were some awful joke, but now... She handed over 3 notes, each typed on plain paper without signature or heading. Miss Marple read them carefully, then folded them into her handbag. Whoever sent these knew something, or wanted to frighten you. But why? Who is her? Miss Marple looked toward the window where rain now streamed down in glistening rivulets. Someone who was never properly mourned, someone forgotten. She rose. It's time I spoke with Lionel March. She found him in the study, perusing a catalogue of porcelain pieces, pencil tucked behind his ear, like an artist on the verge of genius. Ah, Miss Marple, come to discuss antiques, or perhaps you've brought another family secret to light. I do so love family secrets, she replied mildly. They remind me of embroidery, difficult to untangle once a knot has been pulled. He grinned. You're quite the metaphorist. And you, she said softly, are quite the opportunist. He raised an eyebrow. You stole the photograph from Horace's desk, she said. You knew who the girl was, your mother, I believe, Edith Lanyon. The smile vanished. You found the grave and the brooch. You cleaned her stone. And when Horace refused to acknowledge you... I did nothing, he said quickly, standing. I wanted what was mine. That's not a crime. You frightened Beatrice. You prowled the halls. You planted the letters. But Horace, he died because someone lost control. Was that you, Mr. March? He said nothing, only stared at her with eyes that had grown cold. Miss Marple, undeterred, turned and left the room. That evening, as thunder finally cracked open the sky, the house was plunged into darkness. Beatrice, Cora, Lionel, Elsie, and Miles gathered in the parlour by candlelight. The atmosphere was tense, brittle. Miss Marple rose. Before the storm passes, she said gently, I believe we must air out more than just the damp. There is a secret here, one that began long ago with a girl who loved roses and was sent away. She bore a child. She wrote letters. She was buried and forgotten. But she was never truly gone. She looked around the room. And I believe that secret led indirectly to Horace Lytton's death. The candles flickered. Cora gasped, and someone else, someone Miss Marple had suspected all along, gripped their armrests so tightly their knuckles turned white. Keyhole. The storm struck with a vengeance just after 9. Rain lashed against the tall windows, wind howled down the chimney flues, and the electric lights gave a final, resentful flicker before surrendering the house to candlelight. In the flickering shadows of Rosewood Manor's parlour, Miss Marple sat with her usual calm, her knitting abandoned in her lap, her eyes ever watchful. Around her, the occupants of the house bore the weight of more than the weather. Cora had taken to pacing, her arms crossed tight around her chest. Lionel lounged by the fire, too still to be at ease. Miles stood near the doorway, dripping from a dash to the tool shed, while Beatrice and Elsie shared a love seat, the latter visibly shaken. We should all stay in one room, Beatrice said. It's safer. From the storm, Lionel drawled, or from each other. Don't be vile, snapped Cora. Miss Marple merely turned to Elsie. You said the key was behind the linen cupboard. Elsie nodded, her voice thin. Yes, miss. I was putting away towels when I heard it. A clicking sound, soft, like a latch. Then, whispering. I opened the door and there it was, just lying on the shelf. Beatrice frowned. But that cupboard is against the outer wall. There's nothing behind it but stone. Not necessarily, Miss Marple murmured. Many old houses have features forgotten even by their owners. She rose. Come with me, if you will. They ascended the staircase together, each footstep softened by the runner's worn fabric. At the end of the corridor, the linen cupboard loomed, ordinary in appearance, its paint slightly chipped, its hinges faintly rusted. Miss Marple took the key from her sleeve and turned it in her hand, then reaching up, She pushed aside the top shelf of folded linens and felt gently along the back panel. Her fingers paused at a faint groove. With surprising strength, she pressed. There was a muted click, and the back panel swung inward by an inch. Gasps rippled behind her. Candle in hand, Miss Marple stepped forward into the dark. Behind the panel was a narrow crawl space, barely more than a passage, lined with wooden beams and cold stone. Cobwebs shimmered in the candlelight. The air was damp, ancient, and close. "There's something here," she said softly. Cora refused to follow, but Miles brought another candle and joined her, holding it aloft. Further in, they found a crumbling step, descending into a shallow chamber, perhaps once a storage nook or servant's passage. On the floor sat a rusted tin box. Miss Marple knelt with effort and prized it open. Inside were several items wrapped in oilcloth, a woman's glove stained at the fingertips, a torn journal page. "He said I was a mistake, that no one would believe me, but I have written it all, and one day it shall be known." And beneath that, a locket containing a single pressed rose, its thorns carefully trimmed away. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "The voice we keep hearing," she murmured. "It was never a ghost. It was guilt, echoing down a passage too long kept sealed." Back in the parlour, she laid the contents of the box upon the table. The wind outside howled like a living thing, but inside all was hushed, the atmosphere fragile and crackling with fear. She turned to Beatrice. "You never knew about this room?" Beatrice shook her head. "Never. Horace must have had it sealed long before I arrived." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. "So, let us consider what we now have. A forgotten chamber, concealed for decades, a journal, written by Edith Lanyon, hinting at betrayal and fear. A locket, symbolic of someone who tried to keep love while discarding pain. And a key, placed carefully where someone might find it. Perhaps too carefully." Her eyes came to rest on Lionel March. "You've been in every room of this house, Mr. March, except, of course, the ones you already knew." He smiled coolly. "I think you overestimate me." Miss Marple nodded. "Possibly. And yet, someone has gone to great lengths to stir fear, to whisper secrets, to awaken ghosts." Cora spoke suddenly. "And what about the revolver?" Everyone turned to her. "What revolver?" Beatrice asked sharply. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "It was found locked in an old tool cupboard, safely stored, never fired, a symbol more than a threat." Cora swallowed. "Then what is the threat?" Miss Marple looked towards the fire, where the shadows danced in flickers. "The truth, Miss Lytton, that is always the real danger, especially in a house like this." Later that night, the storm abated, but the tension did not. Miss Marple stood at the parlour window, watching as the clouds thinned and the moon broke through. Footsteps approached. It was Beatrice, holding a folded piece of parchment. "I found this in Horace's desk drawer," she said. "It's a codicil to the will, dated just before his death. It names someone new." Miss Marple took it, read it silently, then looked up. "Ah," she said. "That explains rather a lot." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Who?" Miss Marple folded the paper and slipped it into her bag. "Tomorrow," she said. "Let us all gather tomorrow. I believe the time for revelation is very nearly here." And with that, she turned and ascended the stairs, her candle casting a long shadow on the panelled wall, like the last strand of a web just before the spider's return. Chapter 7. Tea and Revelation. It was a calm morning after the storm, the kind that arrives like a breath held too long finally released. The garden shimmered under a wash of pale sunshine, the rose petals glistening with dew and bent under their own weight, as though exhausted by the previous night's howling wind. In the drawing room of Rosewood Manor, a low fire crackled in the grate, and a tea table had been laid with quiet care. A silver service, bone china cups, and a modest sponge cake sat waiting. At the centre of the arrangement stood Miss Marple, perfectly composed as always, her pale blue cardigan draped gently over her shoulders like a shawl of certainty. The household assembled one by one: Beatrice, worn but steady; Cora, arms folded, suspicion coiled tight within her frame; Lionel March, polished as ever, though the set of his jaw betrayed tension; Miles the gardener, silent and watchful, his cap turning slowly in his hands; and Elsie, pale and trembling, seated with her back rigid and eyes darting. "I thought it best," Miss Marple began pleasantly, "to speak plainly and in good company." No one replied. She poured herself a cup of tea and added just 1 sugar. "In my experience, the truth doesn't emerge like a trumpet blast, but more like the unfurling of a fern. A shape that becomes clear only when seen from the right angle." She sipped delicately. "This house has been full of secrets, hidden rooms, burnt letters, broken porcelain, whispers, and locked cupboards. But those were only the symptoms. The real story began long before Horace Lytton's fall. It began with Edith Lanyon." She glanced at Beatrice, whose hands tightened around her cup. She was Horace's cousin, but more than that, I think. There was affection between them, possibly more. A child was born, a child no one in the family acknowledged. Elsie let out a small gasp. "Yes," Miss Marple said, turning to her. "You recognized the monogram on the handkerchief I found, didn't you? E.L., you knew that Horace and Edith had shared something more than mere blood." Elsie nodded slowly, as though against her own will. "My grandmother worked here," she whispered. "She told me once, when I was little, that a baby had been sent away. No name, no claim, just gone. She warned me never to speak of it. And so the child grew up elsewhere," Miss Marple continued, "but not forgotten, because Horace received letters. From Edith, she pleaded, she warned, she loved. And when she died, so young and with no public sorrow, he kept her memory in secret, in a tin box behind a locked panel, in a potting shed no one visited." She turned now to Lionel March. "But secrets don't stay buried forever, do they?" His smile was gone. "You found the letters," she said. "Perhaps not all at once, but enough to suspect the truth, enough to begin asking questions, and eventually enough to be certain that you, Mr. March, were not merely an antique dealer, but Horace Lytton's illegitimate son." The room erupted. Beatrice gasped audibly. Cora stood as if to speak, then sat again. Lionel didn't deny it. His face, too polished until now, had cracked. What emerged was something older, raw. "I didn't come here to steal," he said quietly. "I came to know my mother died with nothing. He had this house, this collection, this family, and he never gave her so much as his name." "You staged the ghostly sounds," Miss Marple continued. "The letters to Beatrice, the figurine, the favourite one, was shattered, not out of rage but symbolism. You wanted to unsettle, to expose something hidden." Lionel looked down. "I wanted the truth seen. But you didn't kill Horace." He looked up sharply. Miss Marple turned now, slowly, to the last face at the table. "Cora!" Cora's eyes widened. "What? How dare you?" "You were at the terrace that evening. Miles saw a figure. You wore a dark coat. Horace had changed his will, hadn't he? You'd seen the draft. You knew Lionel would inherit." Cora's voice was rising. "He's not even legitimate." Miss Marple's tone remained calm. "And that was enough to push you into confronting him, wasn't it? Horace never liked being shouted at, never liked conflict. You grabbed his arm, he pulled away, slipped. I didn't mean to." Cora froze. The silence deepened. Elsie dropped her teacup. It shattered like the figurine. Beatrice stood slowly. "Oh, Cora, he said I'd always been selfish," Cora whispered, shaking. "Said he owed Edith more than me. That boy, he'd never even met him. I just wanted to talk, just to scare him. But he slipped. He hit his head. I panicked." "You opened the back door," Miss Marple said softly. "Tried to make it look like an accident, moved the key, planted hints, but the truth, like ivy, will always find its way through stone." Cora buried her face in her hands. No one moved for a long time. Outside, the morning turned fully to day. The storm had passed. The roses, now wind-stripped, stood exposed, but still blooming. Miss Marple took one last sip of her tea and folded her napkin carefully. "Sometimes," she said, "the roots we try hardest to hide are the ones that grow deepest and strongest." She stood. "I believe the police should be informed." Chapter 8. The Confession Beneath the Ivy. It was a grey and mist-laced morning when Inspector Merivale arrived at Rosewood Manor, his boots leaving damp marks upon the tiled floor of the entrance hall. A man of even temperament and quiet competence, he greeted Miss Marple with a nod of deference, then turned his attention to the drawing room, where Cora Lytton sat pale and unmoving in the armchair nearest the fireplace. She did not resist arrest. There were no hysterics, no last-minute denials. Instead, she merely whispered, "It was supposed to be mine." Miss Marple stood by the window, watching as the inspector led her away with professional care. The front door closed gently behind them. Beatrice, silent until now, let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. "I never thought, not Cora." "She was raised to expect everything," Miss Marple said softly. "But when one's sense of entitlement meets rejection, it often turns to something quite desperate." Lionel stood apart, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Miss Marple turned to him. "She didn't know about the codicil to the will. That's what changed everything." He met her gaze. "He left it all to me." "Who?" Miss Marple nodded. "Not just the estate?" "He acknowledged you, Mr. March, as his son. Quietly in writing, if not aloud." Lionel swallowed. For a long moment he said nothing. Then softly, "He never wrote to me." "Not once." "He may have tried," Miss Marple said gently. "But I suspect someone ensured those letters never reached you." Elsie, who had been hovering by the door, spoke at last. "My Gran, Edith's mother, she said no good ever came from clinging to the past. When she found out Horace had written, she told the postmaster to return the letters, mark them undeliverable." Miss Marple nodded. "She thought she was protecting you, or perhaps Edith's memory, or maybe just her own shame." Lionel sat heavily in the armchair that had so recently held Cora. "So much wasted." Beatrice crossed to him, laying a tentative hand on his shoulder. "Then don't waste what's left." That afternoon, the storm returned. Not in the sky, but in the house itself. As solicitors came and rooms were opened, documents signed, secrets properly filed, and bound in legal envelopes. By evening, silence returned to Rosewood, this time cleaner, more honest. Miss Marple wandered the garden path alone, her shawl tugged gently by the breeze. She paused before the terrace where Horace Lytton had fallen. The elderflowers had been washed away by the storm, but she bent nonetheless and placed a fresh sprig at the base of the balustrade. "I expect," she murmured, "you thought you could outrun it all, but even ivy leaves a trace." As she straightened, footsteps approached. Lionel. "I wanted to thank you," he said. Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I did very little, just listened, and remembered that people tend to repeat their patterns." He handed her a folded sheet of paper. I found this today, in the back of the writing desk, stuffed behind the false panel. Miss Marple unfolded it. It was a letter from Horace to Lionel. My dear boy, I am sorry it has taken me so long. I have made terrible mistakes, but I want to make this right. I hope you will come to Rosewood. I want to know you, and I want the world to know you too. She looked up. I would keep that if I were you. Lionel nodded. I'm not sure what I'll do now, with the house, with the name Live With It, Miss Marple said gently. Not under it. That's how legacies change. That evening, over tea with Beatrice, Miss Marple reflected on the matter as she always did, not in triumph, but in quiet contemplation. It's odd, Beatrice said, how the past never really stays buried. Not when it's watered by grief. Miss Marple nodded. Or guilt? She looked into her cup. Do you remember the Gerhardt sisters from Sussex? One of them swore her chrysanthemums were haunted by the voice of her late fiancé. Of course, it turned out to be the wireless crackling through the conservatory wall, but she was quite convinced, until we discovered the old transmission wire tangled in the vines. Beatrice blinked. Are you saying this was similar? We closed. Another secret unearthed. She returned to her knitting, the rhythm of the needles soft against the distant click-clack of the rails. The truth, she reflected, never vanishes. It simply waits, quietly, patiently, beneath the ivy.